Okay, chapter 11, part 2. So sorry about that. Okay, little Ann started whining and begging for help. I went all to pieces and started crying. Something had to be done and done quickly, for my little dog was lost. I thought of running home for a rope, or for my father, but I knew she couldn't last until I got back. I was desperate. It was impossible for me to swim in the freezing water. I couldn't last for a minute. She cried again, begging for the one last thing. I couldn't give her help. I thought if only I could see her, maybe I could figure out some way I could help. Looking at the lantern gave me an idea. I ran up the bank about 30 feet, turned and looked back. I could see the light, not well, but enough for what I had in mind. I grabbed my lantern and axe and ran for the bottoms. I was looking for a stand of wild cane. After what seemed like ages, I found it. With the longest one I could find, I hurried back. After it was trimmed and the limber cut off, I hung the lantern by the handle on the end of it and started easing it out on the ice. I saw old Dan first. He was sitting close to the edge of the trough, looking down. Then I saw her. I groaned at her plight. All I could see was her head and her small front paws. Her claws were spreading out and digging into the ice. She knew if she ever lost that hold, she was gone. Old Dan raised his head and howled. Hound though he was, he knew it was the end of the trail for his little pal. So if they don't save her, she'll freeze to death. But Billy can't get in because he'll freeze to death. So they got to figure out how to get her out of the ice. I wanted to get my light as close to little Ann as I could, but my pole was a good 8 feet short. Setting the lantern down, I eased the pole from under the handle. I thought, I'm no better off than I was before. In fact, I'm worse off. Now I can see when the end comes. Little Ann cried again. I saw her claws slip in the ice. Her body settled lower in the water. Old Dan howled and started fidgeting. He knew the end was close. I didn't exactly know when I started out towards my dog. I had taken only 2 steps when the ice broke. I twisted my body and fell toward the bank. Just as my hand closed on a root, I thought my feet touched the bottom, but I wasn't sure. As I pulled myself out, I felt the numbing cold creep over my legs. It looked so hopeless. There didn't seem to be any way I could save her. At the edge of the water stood a large sycamore. I got behind it, anything to blot out that heartbreaking scene. Little Ann, thinking I had deserted her, started crying. I couldn't stand it. So he can't save her. And have you ever just not wanted to look at what it is that you need to fix? So he hides, but he hears little Ann. I opened my mouth to call old Dan. I wanted to tell him to come on and we'd go home as there was nothing we could do. The words just wouldn't come out. I couldn't utter a sound. I lay my face against the icy cold bark of the sycamore. I thought of the prayer I had said when I asked God to help me get my 2 hound pups. I knelt down and sobbed out a prayer. I asked for a miracle which would save the life of my little dog. I promised all the things a young boy could if only he would help me. Still saying my prayer and making promises, I heard a sharp metallic sound. I jumped up and stepped away from the tree. I was sure the noise I heard had made a rattling chain by the rattling chain on the front end of a boat. I shouted as loud as I could, "Over here, I need help! My dog is drowning!" I waited for an answer. All I could hear were the cries of little Ann. Again I hollered, "Over here! Over on the bank! Can you see my light? I need help! Please hurry!" I held my breath, waiting for an answering shout. I shivered from the freezing cold in my wet shoes and overalls. A straining silence settled over the river. A feathery rustle swished by in the blackness. A flock of low-flying ducks had been disturbed by the loud shouts. I strained my ears for some sound. Now and then I could hear the lapping slap of the ice-cold water as it swirled its way through the trough. I glanced at little Ann. She was still holding on, but I saw her paws were almost to the edge. I knew her time was short. I couldn't figure out what I had heard. The sound was made by the metal striking metal. What was that? What have caused it? I looked at my axe. It couldn't have been the sound. It couldn't have made the sound as it was too close to me. The sound had come from out on the river. When I looked at my lantern, I knew what had made that sound. I had left the handle standing straight up when I had taken the pole away. Now it was down. For some unknown reason, the stiff wire handle had twisted in the sockets and dropped. As it had fallen, it had struck the metal frame, making the sharp metallic sound I had heard. As I glared at the yellow light, the last bit of hope faded away. I closed my eyes, intending to pray again. for help I so desperately needed. Then, like a blinding red flash, the message of the lantern bore its way into my brain. There was my miracle. There was the way to save my little dog. In the metallic sound I had heard were my instructions. They were so plain I couldn't help but understand them. The bright yellow flame started flickering and dancing. It seemed to be saying, "Hurry! You know what to do." Faster than I had ever moved in my life, I went to work. With the stick, I measured the water in the hole where my feet had broken through the ice. I was right. My foot had touched bottom, 18 inches down. I felt the soft mud. With my pole, I fished the lantern back to the bank. I took the handle off, straightened it out, and bent a hook in one end. With one of my shoelaces, I tied the wire to the end of the cane pole. I left the pole sticking out about 6 inches beyond the end of it. I started shouting encouragement to Lil Ann. I told her to hang on and not give up, for I was going to save her. She answered with a low cry. With the hook stuck in one of the ventilating holes in the top of my light, I lifted it back on the ice and set it down. After a little wiggling and pushing, I worked the hook loose and laid the pole down. I took off my clothes, picked up my axe, and stepped down into the hole of the icy water. It came to my knees. Step by step, breaking the ice with my axe, I waded out. So, a lot of people, when I read this, a lot of the kids will say, "Why did he take his clothes off to get in the water?" What are y'all thinking? Why would he take his clothes off? The water came to my hips and then to my waist. The cold bite of it took my breath away. I felt my body grow numb. I couldn't feel my feet at all, but I knew they were moving. When the water reached my armpits, I stopped and worked my pole toward Little Ann. Stretching my arms as far as I could, I saw I had still a foot short. Closing my eyes and gritting my teeth, I moved. The water reached my chin. So, the reason he didn't do this the first time was he would end up going over his head in the water. So he can only go so far, and he's got a pole. He's made himself a hook so that he can hook onto her. And remember, he doesn't have his clothes on. He's getting in this cold, icy water. I was close enough. I started hooking at the collar of Little Ann. Time by time, I felt the hook almost catch. I saw I was fishing on a wrong angle. She had settled so low in the water I couldn't reach her collar. Raising my arms above my head so the pole would be at a slant, I kept looking and praying. The seconds ticked by. I strained for one more inch. The muscles in my arms grew numb from the weight of the pole. Little Ann's claws slipped again. I thought she was gone. At the very edge of the ice, she caught again. All I could see now were her small red paws and her nose and eyes. So he's got to get it now. By old Dan's actions, I could tell that he understood and wanted to help. He ran over close to my pole and started digging at the ice. I whopped him with the cane. That was the only time in my life I had ever hit my dog. I had to get him out of the way so I could see what I was doing. Just when I thought my task was impossible, I felt the hook slide under the tough leather. It was none too soon. As gentle as I could, I dragged her over the rim of the ice. At first, I thought she was dead. She didn't move. Old Dan started whining and licking her face and ears. She moved her head. I started talking to her. She made an effort to stand up but couldn't. Her muscles were paralyzed and the blood had long since ceased to flow. So, she's really kind of in a bad condition because she's been in that water for so long. At the movement of Little Ann, old Dan threw a fit. He started barking and jumping. His long red tail fanned the air. Still holding on to my pole, I tried to take a step backward. My feet wouldn't move. A cold, gripping fear came over me. I thought my legs were frozen. I made another effort to lift my leg. It moved. I realized that my feet were stuck in the soft, muddy bottom. I started backing out, dragging the water of my body of my little dog. I couldn't feel the pole in my hands. When my feet touched the icy bank, I couldn't feel that either. All the feeling in my body was gone. I wrapped Little Ann in my coat and hurried onto my clothes. With the pole, I fished my light back. So why do you think he took off his clothes? Well, you want to be able to warm your body after. And so if you have wet clothes on after, you wouldn't be able to warm yourself up. So now you can put those warm clothes on. Close by the large drift, I climbed up at the top of it and dug a hole down in the ice and snow until I reached the dry limbs. I poured half of the oil in my lantern down into the hole and dropped in a match. In no time, I had a roaring fire. I laid Little Ann close to the warm heat and went to work. Old Dan washed her head with his warm red tongue while I massaged and rubbed her body. I could tell by her cries, when the blood started circulating, little by little her strength came back. I stood her on her feet and started walking her. She was weak and wobbly, but I knew she would live. I felt much better and breathed a sigh of relief. After drying myself out the best I could, I took the lantern pole handle from the pole, bent it back in its original position, and put it back on the lantern. So, he took that wire piece off that he was holding the lantern with to make his little hook. Now he puts it back on. I started talking to it. I said, "Thanks, old lantern, more than you'll ever know. I'll always take care of you. Your globe will always be clean, and there'll never be any rust or dirt on your frame." I knew if it had not been for the miracle of the lantern, my little dog would have met her death on that night. Her grave would have been cold, icy waters of the Illinois River. Out in the river, I could hear the cold water gurgling in the icy trough. It seemed to be angry. It hissed and growled, and it tore its way through the channel. I shuddered to think of what could have happened. Before I left for home, I walked back to the sycamore tree. Once again, I said a prayer, but this time the words were different. I didn't ask for a miracle. In every way a young boy could, I said thanks. My second prayer wasn't said with just words. All my heart and soul was into it. On my way home, I decided not to say anything to my mother and father about Little Ann's accident. I knew it would scare Mama, and she would stop my hunting. Reaching our house, I didn't hang the lantern in its usual place. I took it to my room and set it in the corner with the handle standing up. The next morning, I started sneezing and came down with a terrible cold. I told Mama I had gotten my feet wet. She scolded me a little and started doctoring me. So, Mama is always really worried anyway, so I think Billy has kind of made a good decision not to tell Mama, but now he's sick. So, for 3 days and nights, I stayed home. All this time, I kept checking the handle for the lantern. My sisters shook the house from the roof to the floor with their playing and romping, but the handle never did fall. I went to my mother and asked if God answered prayers every time no one was said. She smiled and said, "No, Billy, not every time. He only answers the ones that are said from the heart. You have to be sincere and believe in him." She wanted to know what I had said, or why I had asked. I said, "Oh, I just wondered and wanted to know." She came over and straightened my suspenders, saying, "That was a very nice question for my little Daniel Boone to ask." Bending over, she started kissing me. I finally squirmed away from her, feeling as wet as a dirt dauber's nest. My mother never could kiss like a fellow should be kissed. Before she was done, I was kissed all over. It always made me feel silly and baby-like. I tried to tell her that a coon hunter wasn't supposed to be kissed that way, but Mama never could understand things like that. I stomped out of the house to get to see how my dogs were.